The hearing room inside the United States Capitol looked like a stage set for the kind of drama that could define careers. Marble walls rose high above their cold elegance, lit by rows of golden sconces. The deep red carpet muffled footsteps, but it couldn't muffle the tension. Every seat, public gallery, press row, even the narrow benches along the back was filled. A swarm of reporters sat shoulder to shoulder, their cameras ready, lenses aimed like weapons. Every few seconds, a sudden flash cut across the room, momentarily bleaching faces white before shadows fell back in place. The hum of whispered conversations mixed with the faint clink of metal security badges brushing against suit buttons, camera straps tapping against chairs. Somewhere near the front, a court stenographer's fingers hovered above the keys, ready to capture every word, every pause, every breath. Staffers clutched stacks of papers like shields, eyes darting toward the heavy double doors at the back of the chamber. Everyone knew who would walk through them. The air felt heavier than it should have, thick, charged like the moments before a summer storm breaks. Even the overhead lights seemed to glow a little harder, a little hotter. People shifted in their seats, adjusting ties, smoothing skirts, clearing throats that didn't really need clearing. This wasn't just another routine day on the Hill. No, this was the kind of day where a single sentence could ruin a career, where a single piece of paper could turn allies into enemies. And as the doors finally began to open, the murmur in the rooms dipped to nothing, replaced by a silence so sharp it almost hurt to breathe. A soft shuffle of footsteps echoed through the chamber, followed by the faint click of a microphone being switched on. Then came the words that would hang over the room like a dark cloud. $1.2 billion. Gone. The number landed heavy like a gavel striking wood. $1.2 billion money that Congress had approved to build affordable housing for struggling families across America. It was supposed to be bricks, mortar, keys, and hand-safe homes for parents working 2 jobs, for veterans coming back from service, for children sleeping on couches instead of in their own beds. But somewhere between the Treasury and the neighborhoods that needed it most, that money disappeared. Not in one big heist, not in the dead of night, but in 1,000 little transactions, each one with a paper trail so carefully hidden that it took months to even realize the funds were missing. People in the room exchanged uneasy glances. Some scribbled notes, others sat frozen as if moving would make them complicit. The cameras zoomed in on faces, lawmakers, staffers, even members of the public searching for a reaction, for guilt, for fear. And then came the second blow that $1.2 billion wasn't just lost. It was redirected, shifted into shell companies, funneled through political action committees, routed to the same donors and power brokers who now sat comfortably in the back rows. Somewhere out there, families were still waiting for the homes they had been promised. And here, under the glare of the Capitol lights, the question no one wanted to answer hung in the air. Who took it and why? The heavy doors at the back of the hearing room opened, and the air seemed to shift. First came Donald Trump, moving with that unmistakable presence, part showman, part battlefield general. His suit was a sharp, deep blue. The red tie perfectly knotted, the expression on his face carved into something between confidence and warning. In his right hand, he carried a thick folder, its edges frayed as if the papers inside had been handled too many times. Every camera in the room followed him, the click, click, click of shutters rising like hail against the marble walls. A few steps later, Jasmine Crockett entered. Her posture was high chin, slightly lifted eyes, scanning the room with a look that said she had walked into hostile territory before and survived. She wore a tailored gray blazer that seemed to absorb the overhead light and a thin gold necklace that caught it again. Some saw resolve in her gaze, others saw defiance, but no one could deny she was ready for a fight. Then came Jeffries, calm, deliberate, every movement measured. He walked as though he was aware that every second, every gesture would be dissected on cable news by nightfall. A deep charcoal suit, a pale blue tie, and a face that looked carved from stone, no flicker of emotion, just the steady eyes of a man who had faced pressure before. The three of them now stood in the same room, the space between them charged like the gap between 2 storm fronts about to collide. On one side, the accuser armed with documents and a promise to expose the truth. On the other, 2 political heavyweights accused of orchestrating one of the largest housing fund scandals in recent memory. The silence in the room was no longer just tense, it was expectant. Something was about to happen. For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of the accusation hung in the air, heavier than the marble columns that surrounded them. $1.2 billion vanished. Not a rumor, not a clerical error. Gone. Somewhere out there beyond these walls, that money had taken on a new shape. Maybe it was sitting quietly in accounts no one dared to trace. Maybe it had been converted into contracts for companies that didn't exist, names printed on letterhead that would never be answered. Maybe it had already been spent, transformed into power, influence, and silence. Eyes darted from one end of the room to the other. Trump's folder, still unopened, seemed to pulse with possibility or danger. Crockett and Jeffries sat rigid, their faces giving nothing away, but their stillness spoke louder than words. And then came the question, the one that would define everything that followed. Where did that money go, and who in this room walked away richer while entire families were left with nothing? The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the sound of the nation leaning in, waiting for an answer that might never come. Long before the hearing room fell silent, the promises had already been made. They were written into glossy brochures, announced at town hall meetings, and echoed in campaign speeches. Words like opportunity, dignity, and a fresh start were spoken with confidence, as if the future was already built and waiting. Maria Gonzalez remembered the day she first heard about the new housing project. It was a rainy afternoon in the Bronx, the kind where the sky feels too low and the air smells like wet concrete. She had been walking home from her shift at the bakery when she saw a flyer taped to the glass door of the corner store. New affordable housing coming soon. Apply today. For Maria, a single mother raising 2 children in a cramped, peeling one-bedroom apartment, those words were more than an announcement. They were a lifeline. She imagined a kitchen big enough for her kids to do homework at the table, a bedroom where they could sleep without the sound of neighbors fighting through paper-thin walls. In Texas, Jose Ramirez heard a similar promise. A single father of 2, Jose had been working 3 jobs, janitor by dawn, delivery driver by day, warehouse loader by night. He kept a photograph of his kids in his wallet, their smiles a reminder of why he pushed through the exhaustion. When a local official announced that a new development funded by federal housing grants would break ground just blocks from his neighborhood, Jose felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Both Maria and Jose filled out the applications, attended the community meetings, and waited. They waited through seasons changing, through birthdays, through rent increases they could barely manage. And every time they asked about the progress, they were told the same thing. It's coming soon. But as months turned into years, soon began to sound less like a promise and more like a lie. Months after the promises were made, the first sign of progress appeared: a bulldozer, a few stacks of lumber, and a bright banner strung across a chain-link fence, future site of affordable homes. Maria took her kids to see it one Saturday morning. Jose drove by after his night shift just to catch a glimpse. But that was the most activity the site would see for a long, long time. Weeks turned into months and the bulldozer disappeared. The stacks of lumber sat untouched until rain warped the boards and sun bleached them gray. The banner that once stretched proudly across the fence began to curl at the edges, its colors fading under the relentless weather. By the following year, weeds had started to push through the gravel. The air smelled faintly of rust from the abandoned scaffolding. Someone had scrawled graffiti across the plywood barriers, angry words, tired words. "Where's our home?" From the sidewalk, Maria could see right through the gaps in the fence. No foundation had been poured, no walls had been framed. Just empty space where her children's bedrooms were supposed to be. She stood there for a long time, holding her daughter's hand, until the little girl finally asked, "Mom, is this really going to be our house?" Joseph's experience was no different. Each time he drove past, he saw the same stagnant scene. He tried to tell himself that delays were normal, that construction took time. But the longer he waited, the more the lot seemed less like a work in progress and more like a broken promise wrapped in barbed wire. It started with whispers, half-finished conversations in the grocery store, muttered questions at the post office. People wanted to know why the site was still empty, why the promised homes existed only on paper. Then came the rumors. Someone claimed a friend at City Hall had seen the budget reports. Another swore that one of the contractors listed for the project didn't even have an office, just a P.O. box in a strip mall 2 towns over. Maria didn't pay much attention at first. She wanted to believe the delays were just delays. But one evening, while scrolling through her phone, she found an article buried deep in the local news section. The headline was short, almost too plain: "Audit raises questions about housing project funds." The article described payments made to companies with no prior history in construction. Their websites had stock photos of smiling workers in hard hats, But no project portfolio, no verified licenses. One company's address led to a shuttered laundromat. Another was registered to an apartment building in another state. Jose read the same article the next morning before his shift. He noticed a name in the list of contractors, a name he recognized from a campaign flyer for a local politician. That politician had been one of the most vocal supporters of the housing project. The more people asked questions, the fewer answers they got. City officials brushed off concerns, saying everything was under review. But in the quiet spaces between official statements, the truth began to take shape. The money wasn't just delayed. It was being moved, and no one seemed eager to explain where. By now, the story wasn't just whispers in corner stores. It was breaking into living rooms, kitchens, and church halls. People who had never met Maria or Jose began to recognize their faces from small newspaper photos and social media posts. They weren't just names anymore. They were the faces of every family that had been told to wait and then forgotten. At community meetings, the mood shifted. In the beginning, there had been polite questions, the kind that could be brushed aside with vague reassurances. But now people were leaning forward in their chairs, voices rising. Where is the money? Who signed these contracts? Why are our kids still sleeping in hallways? Local radio hosts picked up the story, their callers pouring out anger, live on air. One man's voice cracked as he described his sister disabled, living in a building with mold creeping up the walls, still waiting for a home that was promised 3 years ago. A grandmother called in saying she'd given up her spot in line to a young mother because she believed more units were coming. Now she had nothing, and neither did that mother. In coffee shops, people argued over who was to blame: city officials, contractors, or the politicians who had paraded in front of cameras to announce the project and then vanished. The outrage was no longer just about Maria or Jose. It was about the betrayal of a promise made to an entire community. And for the people watching from home, the anger was contagious. They could feel it in the pit of their stomachs, the sense that if it could happen to Maria, if it could happen to Jose, it could happen to them too. The door at the side of the hearing room opened, and a figure stepped in. Not a politician, not a reporter, but someone who carried the weight of a secret. The nameplate on the witness table read, "Only Confidential Witness HUD." He was in his late 50s, his gray hair cut short, the lines on his face speaking of long nights and harder decisions. In his hands, he carried a thick manila folder, the edges bent and worn from being handled too often. As he approached the microphone, those hands shook, not the nervous tremble of someone unprepared, but the deep, uncontrollable tremor of a man who knew the truth he was about to tell could cost him everything. The room seemed to tighten around him. Even the photographers stopped clicking. He cleared his throat, glanced once at the folder, and then at the committee members staring back at him. "My name," he paused, exhaled, "will remain confidential. But I have worked at the Department of Housing and Urban Development for 22 years. And what I have here," he lifted the folder slightly, "will show exactly where the money went." Every eye locked on that folder. Inside were invoices, internal memos, and wire transfer records. Each page a breadcrumb leading through the maze of shell companies, campaign donations, and falsified project reports. He set the folder on the table and slid it toward the committee chair. The sound of the cardboard scraping against the wood seemed deafening in the silence. And in that moment, everyone in the room knew the story had just changed. Maria Gonzalez sat in the witness chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if holding them together might keep her voice from shaking. She glanced once at the rows of faces staring back at her, the lawmakers, the press strangers who knew her only as the woman in the housing story. Then she took a breath and began. "I applied for the new housing project 5 years ago," she said. "They told me it would be ready in 18 months. I believed them." Her voice was calm, but the story was anything but. She described her current apartment, a one-bedroom unit in a building so old the paint peeled from the walls in long curling strips. The bathroom ceiling had a spreading brown stain that dripped whenever it rained. In the winter, the draft from the cracked window was so strong she had to stuff old towels into the frame just to keep her children warm. "We live with mold," she continued, her tone tightening. "It's in the bathroom, in the kitchen cabinets, and it makes my son's asthma worse. I've shown the landlord. I've called the city, but they tell me to wait. They all tell me to wait." The committee members shifted in their seats. Maria explained how she had rearranged her life. In anticipation of the move, saving for new furniture, packing up belongings in boxes that still sat sealed in the corner of her living room. For 5 years, she said, my children have asked when we will move. For 5 years, I've said, soon. But soon never comes. Her final words cut through the air like a blade. We are not asking for charity. We are asking for what was promised, for what was paid for what was taken. The room stayed silent long after she stopped speaking. Jose Ramirez took the stand with the quiet, steady movements of a man used to long days and short nights. His hands were rough, calloused from years of labor. He didn't carry notes. He didn't need them. His story was carved into him. I'm a single father, he began, 2 kids. My daughter is 9. My son just turned 7. I work 3 jobs, janitor at a school in the morning, delivery driver in the afternoon, warehouse loader at night. He spoke without drama, but each word carried weight. He described leaving home before sunrise, his children still asleep, and coming back well after dark, too tired to do more than kiss their foreheads and whisper goodnight. I tell them I'm doing this so we can have our own home, he said. Not just a place to sleep, but a place to live. When the affordable housing project was announced in his neighborhood, Jose felt like the years of exhaustion might finally mean something. He filled out the paperwork. He attended every meeting. He showed his kids the spot where their new home would be. I told them, that's where we're going to live, he said. They started planning which wall to paint first, but months turned into years. The construction site stayed empty. Rent kept climbing. Jose had to move his family twice each time into smaller, more crowded apartments just to keep them under a roof. Do you know what it's like, he asked the room, to work every waking hour and still have your kids sleeping on a pull-out couch? He looked down for a moment, his voice tightening. I'm not asking for favors. I'm asking for what we were promised. I'm asking for the home my kids already believe is theirs. The silence in the room was thick. For the people watching at home, Joseph's voice wasn't just his own. It was theirs. When Jose stepped down from the witness stand, the air in the room felt heavier, as if every word he and Maria had spoken was still hanging there, refusing to fade. For a moment, no one moved. Then somewhere in the gallery, a woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Another person, an older man in a faded veteran's cap, let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. A low murmur began to ripple through the audience. It wasn't idle chatter, it was the sound of anger building, of people realizing that what had happened to Maria and Jose wasn't an isolated tragedy, but part of something bigger, something rotten. One mother stood up in the back, holding a sleeping toddler in her arms. Do you hear them? She called out, her voice trembling. This is happening to all of us. Her words cracked the silence, and suddenly more voices joined in. They took our homes. Where's the justice? Enough is enough. The committee chair banged the gavel, calling for order. But it was too late. The emotions in the room could not be contained. Some people were crying openly now, their shoulders shaking. Others leaned forward, fist-clenched eyes locked on the row of officials at the front, as if daring them to look away. It wasn't just sorrow. It wasn't just fury. It was both grief for what had been lost and outrage for how it had been stolen. And as the cameras captured every tear, every shout, every clenched jaw, one thing was clear. This was no longer just a hearing. It was a reckoning. The committee chair adjusted his glasses, glanced at the stack of documents handed over by the HUD insider, and nodded to the lead investigator. A large monitor flickered to life at the front of the hearing room. This, the investigator began, as an internal email chain obtained from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It is dated 18 months after the funding for the affordable housing project was approved, and it is addressed to one of the key contractors. The first email appeared on the screen, short, blunt, with no attempt at subtlety. Redirect the remaining budget from Phase 2 into the committee account. The PAC will handle distribution. Make sure the invoices match the original project code so nothing raises a flag. Gasps broke out in the audience. Some leaned forward, squinting to read the words for themselves. Then came the reply from the contractor, displayed in black and white. Understood. Funds will be routed to the Crockett campaign and the Jeffries leadership PAC as discussed. Paper trail will align with initial grant documentation. The room erupted. Reporters scrambled to jot down quotes. Cameras zoomed in on the screen. Committee members whispered urgently to each other. The investigator's voice cut through the noise. These are not allegations. These are direct written instructions to divert federal housing funds, money meant for families like Maria and Jose, into political campaigns. The camera panned across the table to where Jasmine Crockett and Hakeem Jeffries sat. Crockett's jaw was tight, her eyes fixed on the table. Jeffries leaned back, his lips pressed into a thin line. Neither spoke. And in that silence, the weight of those words redirect the budget hung over the room like a sentence already passed. The investigator didn't stop there. With a slow, deliberate motion, he clicked to the next slide. The monitor filled with a scanned copy of a bank transfer receipt, dates, account numbers, and a sum that made the entire room hold its breath. This, he said, tapping the screen, as a $2.4 million worth transfer made just 3 weeks after that email chain we showed you. The sender, the primary contractor for the affordable housing project. The recipient, a company called Urban Vision Consulting LLC. A pause. Then he added, Urban Vision Consulting has no website, no office address, no employees listed. And yet he clicked again. This same account made 3 separate donations to political entities tied to the Crockett and Jeffries campaigns, totaling exactly $2.4 million. A collective murmur swept through the hearing room. One senator muttered under his breath, "That's money laundering, plain and simple." On the screen, an organizational chart appeared, red arrows connecting the contractor, the shell company, and the campaign committees. The arrows felt like daggers aimed straight at the heart of the committee's integrity. The investigator's voice was calm, but it carried the sharp edge of a verdict. These funds didn't just vanish. They were washed, repackaged, and weaponized for political gain. Gasps, whispers, and the frantic clicking of cameras filled the air. Every face in the room knew this was the point of no return. It happened in minutes, faster than anyone in that room could have predicted. Before the hearing even adjourned, the first push notifications began to buzz on phones across the chamber. Breaking: 1.2B housing fund linked to political donations Senate hearing. Erupts exclusive leaked documents. Tie key lawmakers to misuse of affordable housing funds. Cameras swiveled. Reporters scrambled toward the hallway, already shouting into phones, dictating copy that would go live within seconds. Outside, a sea of microphones waited. The marble steps of the Capitol became a battlefield of flashing lights and shouted questions. By evening, the story had devoured the news cycle. Every major network had it on the chyron. Talk shows dissected every frame of the hearing footage, slowing it down, zooming in on the moment the wire transfer receipt appeared on the screen. And then came the tidal wave of public reaction. Online comment sections exploded. They stole from the poor to fund their politics. Disgusting. If this doesn't lead to prison, then the system is broken. Outside government buildings, small protests began to swell. Homemade signs appeared, some furious, others pleading for justice. In coffee shops, in living rooms, in taxi cabs, the same question kept echoing: how deep does this go? For the committee members sitting in that hearing, it was no longer just about the evidence. It was about survival in the court of public opinion. And then silence. Not the comfortable kind, but the kind that presses down on your chest, making it hard to breathe. In that moment, one thought burned in every mind, from the reporters in the back row to the millions watching at home. With the evidence laid bare, the money trail exposed, will they walk away free? Because if they do, what does that say about the system we live in? The Senate chamber had seen heated hearings before, but never like this. Every seat was taken, the marble walls echoing with the low hum of whispered speculation. This wasn't just another political theater performance. It was a collision course between some of the most explosive personalities in Washington. Donald Trump sat at the witness table, his trademark red tie blazing against the dark wood. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a faint smirk tugging at his lips as if daring anyone to challenge him. Across from him, Representative Jasmine Crockett adjusted her glasses, eyes locked like a laser on her target. Beside her, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries shuffled his notes with deliberate precision, the calm before a storm. Cameras were everywhere on tripods, and journalists' hands even mounted above for the perfect overhead shot. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of anticipation. The clerk's voice rang out, "The committee will come to order." Crockett leaned forward, her voice sharp as steel. "Mr. Trump, let's talk about the $1.2 billion. Trump's smirk widened. "Happy to, but you're not gonna like what you hear," the room erupted. Flashes popped, reporters typed furiously. In that moment, everyone knew this wasn't just a hearing, it was a battle. At first, Trump's confidence was unshakable, leaning back, tossing quick jabs, smiling as if the whole hearing were just another campaign rally. Across the table, Crockett and Jeffries, mirrored that confidence, calm poise, certain they had the upper hand. But then the rhythm began to shift. Crockett slid a thick folder across the table. This, she said, her voice cool but edged with steel, is from HUD's own records transactions tied directly to your campaign fund. Trump's smirk faltered, not much, just enough for the cameras to catch. Jeffries jumped in, and here's where the contractor payments vanish into shell companies registered under your associates' names. A murmur rippled through the room. Trump leaned forward now, no longer lounging, eyes narrowing. His replies grew shorter, sharper, less swagger, more defense. Across the table, Crockett noticed. Jeffries noticed. The press noticed. And for the first time in the hearing, the man who once thrived on dominance was reacting, not leading. The hearing room felt smaller now, the air thicker. Every camera was trained on Trump, catching the subtle signs, the tightened jaw, the shifting posture. Crockett leaned in her tone, leaving no space for detours. Mr. Trump, on March 14, 2022, did you authorize a transfer of $62 million from HUD housing funds to Liberty First? Pack Trump opened his mouth, but Jeffries cut in before he could pivot. Yes or no, Jeffries demanded, his voice rising just enough to pierce the murmurs in the room. Trump tried to change the subject, mentioning witch hunts and fake news, but Crockett struck again. Answer the question. Under oath. Every question was a strike, precise, direct, and unavoidable. Dates, account numbers, wire transfer codes, each one hitting like a drumbeat in the chamber. The once smirking former president was now flipping through his notes, searching for lifelines that weren't there. The tension was suffocating. Even the reporters stopped typing for a moment, sensing that history was being written right there in real time. The barrage of questions paused, not because the pressure had eased, but because a new kind of storm was about to break. From the back of the hearing room, a frail hand rose. Maria Gonzalez stood clutching a folder that had been worn soft from years of being carried. Her voice trembled, but every word cut through the silence. Mr. Trump, you don't know me, but I know what you took from us. 5 years of promises while my children slept on a mattress in a moldy apartment. You spoke of the American dream, but you sold ours. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras swung toward her. Next, Jose Ramirez stood. His work-worn hands were clenched so tight his knuckles whitened. 3 jobs, Mr. Trump. 3. And still no home for my family because the money meant for us ended up in your pockets. How do you justify that? Even the committee members sat back, momentarily stripped of their political armor. Crockett's eyes glistened. Jeffries bowed his head. The audience wasn't just watching a hearing anymore. They were living a moment of collective reckoning. Trump shifted in his seat, the air in the room, now charged not with politics, but with something far more dangerous to him, empathy. The shift was almost imperceptible, at first a sideways glance here, a whispered exchange there. But soon it became undeniable. The senators who had been nodding along to Trump's words just hours earlier now sat stiff, their eyes carefully avoiding his. Senator McAllen, a longtime Republican stalwart, was the first to move. He leaned into his microphone, voice steady but laced with finality. Mr. Chairman, I think it's clear we need a full independent investigation. This committee can no longer ignore the evidence. The words landed like a hammer. Another ally, Senator Briggs, cleared his throat and muttered, "We have to protect the party's integrity." The cameras caught him sliding his chair an inch away from Trump. Trump scanned the faces around him. The people who had once laughed at his jokes defended his every move. One by one, they were shrinking back, hands, folded, eyes downcast. The image was unmistakable. The once commanding figure now sat alone at the center of the storm. The public gallery was silent, watching a political empire begin to crumble in real time. The room had already turned cold for Trump, but now it grew deadly quiet, like the stillness before a thunderclap. Senator Evelyn Carter, a respected figure across party lines, leaned forward and spoke into her mic, her voice clear enough to cut through every whisper. Mr. Trump, this nation cannot afford to have its trust eroded any further. For the sake of the country, you need to resign. The air seemed to vanish from the room. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of Trump's expression. Then came Senator Douglas Reeves, his voice gruff but steady. Step down, Mr. Trump. Spare this country the chaos. One by one, others followed, some choosing strong, fiery words, others letting their silence speak as they nodded in agreement. The call was no longer partisan, it was unanimous in tone. In the gallery, Maria Gonzalez clasped her hands, a faint glimmer of hope, replacing the exhaustion in her eyes. Jose Ramirez exhaled as though for the first time in years. Trump shifted in his seat, realizing that the fight wasn't just political anymore, it was personal. And he was losing. Outside the Capitol, the sound was deafening, thousands of voices chanting in unison, drums pounding like war beats banners, waving against the gray winter sky. Housing for the people, justice for the $1.2 billion. The steps of the building were covered with signs, some hand-painted in haste. Others professionally printed, each one a loud accusation. Meanwhile, online, the fire burned just as hot. Within hours, hashtags like, "Where's the money?" Had to resign now, and hashtag justice for Maria and Jose had surged to the top of Twitter's trending list. TikTok was flooded with videos, clips of the hearings, emotional testimonies, and citizens demanding answers. Even late-night talk shows picked it up, monologues laced with biting sarcasm aimed at the political elite. For once, the streets and the screens were speaking the same language: outrage. Trump's team scrambled, releasing statements, trying to control the narrative, but every hour the noise grew louder. It was no longer just politics. It had become a movement, and movements don't go quietly. Inside the committee chamber, the air felt heavier than ever. Every whisper, every sideways glance carried the same unspoken truth: there was no turning back. For Trump, the path ahead was now a narrow, crumbling bridge. The political lifelines that had once pulled him out of trouble were cut one by one. Every ally who stayed silent was already halfway gone. Every defense felt weaker than the last. Crockett's eyes locked on him, not with anger, but with the quiet certainty of someone who knew the tide had turned. Jeffries sat poised, ready to strike with the final blow when the moment came. In the gallery, Maria and Jose exchanged a glance. For them, this wasn't about politics. This was about the years stolen, the promises broken. And they could feel it. The scales were tipping, and justice was finally within reach. The realization spread like a chill. Whatever happened next, the events of this day could never be undone. The point of no return had been crossed. The only question now was, how hard would the fall be? The room went silent, not the tense silence from earlier, but the stunned, breathless kind. The chairwoman leaned toward the microphone, her voice steady, deliberate. "Effective immediately," she said, "a joint criminal task force will be formed between the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the Office of the Inspector General to investigate the disappearance of the $1.2 billion allocated for affordable housing." Gasps echoed across the chamber. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Camera shutters fired like rapid gunfire. This wasn't just politics anymore. It was a criminal investigation, and the stakes had just shifted from bad headlines to prison sentences. Trump's jaw tightened. Crockett's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. Jeffries leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the defendants like a chess master watching checkmate unfold. Out in the hall, protesters erupted into cheers, their chants thundering through the marble corridors. The moment felt historic, one of those rare instances when the system actually seemed ready to fight back. The chairwoman's voice carried through the chamber like the toll of a great bell, measured, resonant, impossible to ignore. She looked directly at the accused, then turned her gaze toward the cameras broadcasting live to the nation. "Let me be clear," she said, each word deliberate. "No one, no matter how powerful, how wealthy, or how connected, is above the law." The sentence landed like a hammer strike. It wasn't just for Trump or for the officials squirming in their seats. It was for every citizen who had ever wondered if the rules only applied to the powerless. Crockett's chin lifted in pride. Jeffries allowed himself a single sharp nod. In the gallery, Maria Gonzalez clasped Jose Ramirez, hand, tears in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the long-awaited relief that justice might finally find them. Outside, the crowd erupted, their cheers mixing with the chants of justice for all. The words would replay on news loops, in living rooms, and in history books. This was more than a hearing. It was a declaration, a warning, and maybe, just maybe, the start of something better. As the crowd's roar softened, the camera shifted no longer on the politicians, but on the people who had been invisible for too long. Maria Gonzalez stood in the sunlight outside the Capitol steps, the wind catching her hair. She smiled for the first time in years, holding a manila envelope, the official notice that her family would finally receive a safe, permanent home. Beside her, Jose Ramirez rested a calloused hand on his daughter's shoulder. She clutched a small, worn teddy bear, the only thing she had carried from their mold-infested apartment. For the first time, her laughter rang out, unshadowed by the fear of another winter without heat. In the background, others, once faceless statistics, now stood as living proof that justice could reach those who needed it most. Some embraced, some wept, some simply stared at the Capitol as if memorizing the place where the tide had finally turned. It wasn't a perfect ending. The wounds were still there. But hope, fragile, hard-won, and long overdue, was back. And this time they intended to keep it. As the sun dipped behind the Capitol dome, the final words rang out, not from a politician, but from a woman whose life had been shaped by the injustice we had just witnessed. Justice, she said, her voice steady, is not a gift handed down from the powerful. It's a fire we have to keep alive ourselves. And if we stop demanding it, it dies. Those words cut deeper than any headline, any speech. They were a reminder that the fight for truth and fairness isn't a one-time battle, but a lifelong duty. Justice doesn't live in marble halls or courtrooms. It lives in the voices of those who refuse to be silenced. And as long as those voices rise together, no amount of money, power, or corruption can erase them. This story is more than political drama, it's a mirror. It reminds us that corruption thrives in silence, and that the fight for justice is not someone else's job, it's ours. Every time we speak up, every time we stand together, we push the world a little closer to fairness. If you believe in truth, fairness, in the courage to stand against injustice, then join us. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you never miss a story that the mainstream won't tell you. Your voice matters. Let's make it louder together.